But there's a lot we do throughout our life that also affects our brain health. And not just what we do in our younger life, but also in our midlife and in our late life. And even if you have symptoms or signs, there's a lot of things you can do to help your brain feel better, to live better, so better quality of life, to slow down decline, to prevent or delay onset. So there's a lot of agency that you have over your brain health. Jana spoke to you about communicating with people. And the reason it's so important is that your brain can be affected in many different ways. It can be affected in your thinking, so memory, your language, your ability to do complex tasks, your ability to navigate space. It can also be affected in your behavior, in your feelings. You can feel sad, you can feel anxious, you can feel out of control. You may feel angry, frustrated. All of these things can be manifestations of brain health. And it can also affect movement. So pathways in your brain are very interconnected. And they're interconnected in that you may have one, multiple, or all of these symptoms going on at the same time. So the movement pathways also affect your cognition. So if you have Parkinson's disease, it doesn't just affect your walking and your balance and your tremors. It actually affects your thinking and memory. This is why, because our brain is so interconnected in the pathways. So let's talk about prevention. And this is a pyramid we use in all of medicine. So let's see if my laser pointer works. Oh, it works. So primary prevention is health promotion. This is in the community when people do not have symptoms. So this is kind of like you going to your primary care doctor, them doing blood work on an annual basis, making sure you don't have diabetes. So before you have diabetes, to detect diabetes. Or before you have colon cancer, doing scopes to find if you're at risk of colon cancer. And we are moving towards that. So primary prevention is things we should do at baseline, now, today, tomorrow, every day, to help our brain health. Secondary prevention is when we screen someone and we find that they're at risk of developing the disease. So that may be someone in your family has dementia or Parkinson's disease or another neurological disease, and that makes you at risk of developing it in the future. And so doing something to help prevent that. Or perhaps you've had strokes in the past and you want to prevent more from happening. And finally, we have tertiary prevention. This is when you have been affected by something and now we want to prevent more of that happening. So now you have memory problems, you have a diagnosis. Well, we want to prevent decline. So there are many, many ways in which we can tackle this, but the most important thing to understand is that it goes on throughout our life. So I don't know that you can actually see this very well, but I'll walk you through this. I'm actually going to walk. So what you can see here is that this is your life trajectory all the way. And this was developed by the Lancet Commission in 2020. So every few years, the Lancet Commission gets together and does a sweeping review of the data in the entire world to look for modifiable risk factors for dementia. And they did this in 2020, and they found 12 modifiable risk factors. That accounts for about 40% of risk of dementia in the world. That's 40% we have control over. 60% of the risk is unknown. But 40% we have control over. That's a lot of agency. The very first, early on in life, 7% of our risk is dictated by education. So, by education, I don't mean all of us have to get master's degrees. By education, I mean finishing high school. And we'll talk about the data in a little bit more detail. But what's really important then, at a societal and community level, is to understand how important our educational system is. Free schooling to grade 12, so how important it is for our generations to finish high school. This is accounting for 7% of our risk. In our midlife, we have a lot of risk factors that we develop. Number one, 8% of our risk is untreated hearing loss. Untreated hearing loss is the most modifiable risk factor you have in your life. And we will talk about why, the pathways of that, in a little bit. But I'm going to bring back that plug we had about listening to that Dementia Untangled podcast episode by Dr. Ahmed, where she delves into this in a lot of detail. So for all of those people who have to turn up the volume off their TV and their spouse or their daughter or their son is saying to them, Mom, Dad, maybe you need to go get your hearing checked out. I tell my dad this like every 2 days. And you don't want to go get a hearing aid because, it makes you look old when you're 55. Well, I tell them this. If I gave you glasses, would you wear them? Yes, you would. Why? Because it helps you see better. Same idea with hearing aid. It helps you hear better. When you first put on your hearing aids, it really sucks. There's a lot of noise. It's loud. You haven't probably heard some frequencies in a little while, especially frequency of high-pitched voice like mine. And it feels screechy. And the reason for that is hearing aids may need to be adjusted, but also your brain is not used to hearing things. So you need to teach your brain how to hear. And that's why getting your hearing treated is so important. Other risk factors in midlife include traumatic brain injury. That's the second highest one. And we'll talk about the details of that in another slide, but it's very important to prevent injury to your brain throughout your life. That includes high-impact sports. Now, I cannot take away all of pleasures of life, right? So I cannot tell you don't ever, play a sport that you enjoy, but use as much protective equipment as possible. If you like riding a motorcycle, which I know a lot of people in Arizona do, use as much protection for your brain as possible. If you like going to ski, use as much protection as possible. Next is high blood pressure. Treating your high blood pressure is extremely important, and I'll show you data from our brain bank to show that, but it's very, very important. Take your high blood pressure medication. Now, I know that I'm really intimidating and scary, and most people walking into my office will have a high blood pressure. They do. That's okay. When I say high blood pressure, I mean get yourself a blood pressure machine or go to your local pharmacy, and you can actually get blood pressure readings on different times of the day and over the next 2 to 3 weeks and figure out if your blood pressure is staying consistently high. And then you should bring those readings to your primary care physician and discuss your treatment options. The better your blood pressure is treated, the less fluctuations it has, the better your risk, or the more your risk reduction in dementia. The last two is a problem in our society: alcohol and obesity. We all like McDonald's. We live busy, fast lives. It's easy to drive through. In fact, we stopped at Starbucks on our way here. Unfortunately, it affects our brain, these choices we make on a daily basis. And we'll talk about some ways in which we can help our brain eat better, but really reduce the amount of fast food and alcohol. I'll say this, and not to harp on this, but alcohol is a toxin. It's a toxin to every part of your nervous system, not just the brain. Your brain, your nerves, your spinal cord, your cerebellum, which is the balance organ of your brain. It's toxic all the time, everywhere. Now, like I said, cannot take away all pleasures of life. Plus, I know there are studies out there that will say, well, if you have a glass of wine a day, it's great for your heart, out there. But really, in moderation. And by moderation, I mean no more than 14 beverages for men a week, and no more than 7 alcoholic beverages for women in a week. And the size of that beverage, your glass of wine cannot be half a bottle. Okay? It has to be a 5-ounce or 6-ounce glass of wine. I know a lot of people that come into my clinic and they tell me, well, I don't feel intoxicated. You don't have to feel intoxicated for it to be too much. When your brain is declining, because remember, alcohol is part of the equation. There are other things that figure into your equation. So if you're having decline in cognitive function and you're drinking alcohol, it's not helping. That's why if you have a balance problem, maybe because you have diabetes and you have neuropathy, the alcohol makes it worse. That's why you fall. Then you get the brain injury. You see how this is snowballing? And that's why it's so important to think about how alcohol affects our brain. In our late life, we have lots of modifiable risk factors. Smoking is one of them. It's about 5% of our risk. Now, back in the day, when my dad was a young man, it was cool to smoke. Then we ran campaigns to say cigarette smoking is terrible for the health. And then my generation actually got better at this. So over the course, we were able to reduce with laws, with restrictions and where you can smoke, as a public health matter, the rate of smoking. Well, now kids are vaping. So we have a new generation that is again affecting their lungs, and we have no idea how this will affect their brain. So very, very important to talk to your family members about some of these risk factors. Okay, the last little bit here is also very important. depression can affect anyone, anytime in their life, but particularly our elderly in our society are at high risk of depression due to social isolation, and social isolation due to depression is a two-way street. So it's very important to build communities, and it's very important that dementia-friendly communities like this reach out. We reach out to each other. We make friends. We find walking buddies. We go to the pool together. This is why this is so, so important. Part of my childhood was spent in India. And one of the things I always say is that my grandfather broke his hip and was bedbound for about 5 years of his late life, but never stopped talking. It's because there was a constant area of people passing through the street that was overlooked by his window side. That was just by his window side. So every day all the kids would go to school and say, "Hey grandpa, how's it going?" And the kids were just kids in the community. And while that is not really possible in the North American society, we still can do a lot. We can have community centers for our seniors, and also more importantly, we need to increase public transportation for our seniors, because most of us have difficulty driving, and if you start to have cognitive dysfunction, your doctors will tell you not to drive. So now it's difficult. Now we're really putting you into the mode of depression and social isolation. So we need to have infrastructure. We need to tell our governments to put in infrastructure that helps our seniors get to these places so they don't get these risk factors. Because they all add up. This is 5%, this is 4%, this is another 4%. Okay, the last little bit here is physical inactivity, air pollution, and diabetes. So air pollution is something that's a global problem. While you don't have direct control over it in your life, you can't just move cities because of air pollution, although some people do. But you can do your bit, right, for climate change and pollution. We're moving towards that. You can impact health policies by impacting climate policies, pollution policies. You can recycle, that sort of thing. And then physical activity. I cannot stress this enough, how important this is. Now, as we all get older, it becomes more and more difficult to stay physically active. We have arthritis in our knees. We have pain in our back. We have had degenerative disc disease. We have neuropathy that is causing constant tingling and pain. It's not easy. And we have gained weight. So it's not easy. But something is better than nothing. So we all have to be as active as we possibly can be, given the constraints of our other physical medical conditions. And the last one here is diabetes. Diabetes is terrible for every organ of your body, period. Terrible for your brain, terrible for your nerves, terrible for your eyes, terrible for your pancreas, really heart, right? Anything. Diabetes is the worst, and kidneys also affect your kidneys. So do everything you can if you have diabetes, type 1 or type 2, to either treat it as well as you can or prevent it from ever happening.